So we are very excited for the arrival of one of our new professors at NC State University in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, otherwise known as CHAS, and in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, Dr. Kyung Hee Ha. Dr. Ha, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to talk with me. I just wanted to sit down with you and first of all, welcome you to the Wolfpack.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome and for having me.
So I wanted to interview you today to ask just a bit about your background and where you grew up and your path to NC State, joining us here in Raleigh, and how did you get into higher education?
Right. So my students get confused because I'm a professor of Japanese language and culture, and yet my name doesn't sound exactly Japanese. So the first question they ask, where are you from? Are you a Korean? Some students understand that this is a Korean name. So I always start by introducing how I was born and raised. And so I am a third generation Zainichi Korean, or a Korean descendant from the wartime era. That means my grandparents came to Japan from Korea when Korea was under Japanese rule, and they never went back. And my parents were born and raised in Japan, specifically in Kyoto. And I was born and raised in Kyoto with 3 brothers. So that's where I received my primary education. But growing up as a Korean in a smaller city in Japan, I felt I was always very different. And I wanted to blend in, but I didn't know how. Even though I look, the same as everybody else, and I spoke Japanese. In fact, I only spoke Japanese as my language. I knew that I was an outsider for different reasons. So at age 15, I decided to study abroad, and I went to Ohio for a year as an exchange student. I didn't get to choose the place, and Ohio was a wonderful place. And there, I learned about, sociology and also race and ethnicity. There were classes offered in high school to think about these things. And I was very intrigued by these concepts and different cultures and diversity, multiculturalism. So upon my return to Japan after 1 year of exchange, I decided to study sociology, and I went to a university in Japan. And there I met a professor who was educated at UCLA, and she was an expert on Japanese Americans and their collective memory about internment camp. And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. And I also felt some resemblance, between their experience and my experience being a Zainichi Korean in Japan, kind of perpetual outsider. And when the war happens, you become a scapegoat, and et cetera, et cetera. So I decided I wanted to do comparative studies between Japanese Americans and Zainichi Koreans. So I decided to study abroad, and I went to San Francisco State for my master's in ethnic studies, because I wanted to use race as a primary lens of analysis when I do the comparison. And long story short, I changed my topic because I met a lot of Zainichi Koreans, actually. So Koreans from Japan who immigrated to America. So they were kind of doubly marginal, doubly minority. And I was interested in their life stories. So I ended up interviewing 20 plus of these individuals that I met through individuals' connections. And I wrote my MA thesis. And after that, I went to Korea for about 7 months to learn Korean language. And I also wanted to, experience living in the country that my grandparents grew up, but never got to return to. And my grandparents were aging at the time, and they were forgetting Japanese. And I also wanted to communicate with them. So I wanted to learn Korean. And that was such an eye-opening experience, because growing up in Japan was a different era than now. There was no Hairyuu, there was no Korean wave at the time when I was growing up. So Korean language was not seen as anything fancy. It was something that you shouldn't speak in public because it's it's a shame that you speak that language. So I never had a chance to really learn because it was, a stigma at the time. But I think learning the Korean language in ancestral homelands and I think learning the cultural value that my grandparents were living with. And I think I was finally able to understand why my grandparents were the way they were. And so that was such a great experience. And then after that, I went to UC San Diego for my PhD program, also in ethnic studies. And there I was mostly researching about Zainichi Koreans at the intersection of US and Japanese imperialism, and then also at the nexus of North and South Koreas. So very long background, but this is how I got to the PhD program. And this is how I got the opportunity to research and teach at NC State.
And I believe before NC State, you were at Meiji
Yes.
University, which is in Tokyo.
Yes.
Right. And how long were you there?
I was there for 6.5 years.
A lot of people think that Japan is one thing, especially a lot of people from Western backgrounds. And one of the enormous misconceptions is that Japan is a homogenous society. And it's not. It's a multi-ethnic society. Just the fact, just taking one fact to demonstrate at the macro level this kind of misconception, even within Japan, especially within Japan, is the fact that the government in Japan didn't recognize the Ainu peoples, the Aboriginal peoples of Japan, as being the Aboriginal peoples of Japan until I think it was 2018, perhaps. So yes, all of these areas of study, especially having to deal with ethnicity and identity, are so incredibly important. And we're so happy that you're here and exploring these topics with our students, because that really gives them an advantage and a leg up and being more educated about Japan in a very real way. I wanted to ask you a bit about this area of research, because I found that it can often be an uncomfortable subject for many people. There's this concept of and I think a lot of people don't know this term or don't understand the background of this term, Yamato. Like this term that if you look into a dictionary and look up Yamato, it is sometimes defined as, the ethnic Japanese is Yamato. But it has a lot of connotations that go well beyond that. And we see this term being used even in modern Japanese. We have Yamato transport, right? The Kuroneko Yubin, or like the postal service called Yamato. We have, even in popular culture, Battleship Yamato, right? The manga and anime, and even terms such as Yamato Nadeshiko, which is this sort of idealized, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this sort of idealized image of what a Japanese woman should look like aesthetically. But I just wanted to get some of your, I know this is a very deep subject, but if you feel comfortable, if you could just give me a few thoughts about this term specifically.
Thank you very much. So as you said, this word is embedded in our everyday life, and maybe perhaps many of us don't even think about the meaning of it and then just use it casually. But what's interesting about this concept is that perhaps that's something a little bit different from the United States, is that being Japanese or being Yamato, it has a connotation that you're ethnically Japanese, but also that's the condition of for you to become a Japanese national. So there's no separation of ethnicity and nationality in many people's imagination in Japan. So when they say Japanese or Yamato, they assume, the assumption is that you're ethnically Yamato and your nationality is Japanese. And you grew up in Japan, you speak the Japanese, and et cetera, et cetera. So this does not allow any room for non-Yamato Japanese, for example. So what about the Ainu? You know, Ainu has been recognized as the indigenous population of Japan, but Okinawan have not been recognized, right, by the Japanese government. How do you situate these people? They are Japanese national by nationality law, but they're different ethnic groups. You know, what about mixed race Japanese people, like Osaka Naomi, the tennis player, and many athletes we have in Japan representing Japan? How do you expand the meaning of Japanese? And I think in order to expand and then also really deconstruct what Japaneseness means, I think we have to really tackle with what Yamato means for a lot of people's imagination. And what's interesting is, as you said, Yamato Nadeshiko is a great example how the ethnicity is closely tied to the idea of gender or gender performance. So there are certain expectations for women for being Japanese, for Yamato, and for being women. And on the other hand, there are also certain, expectations for being male and Yamato as well, and non-male, non-Yamato as well. So in order to allow these diverse beings to be, in the Japanese society, I think we really need to tackle with this Yamato concept of what it really means. And I think it has to come from the inside, and it has to be deconstructed from inside.
Thank you for those thoughts. Yeah, I mean, having lived and worked in Japan and being introduced to these concepts, I had colleagues that I'm still incredibly close with that, for example, were born and raised in Japan, but their parents were from someplace like Nigeria. And so their appearance is not this, first of all, it doesn't look, they don't look Asian, just in a general way. And then more specifically, what various groups might term to be East Asian looking, which, whether that's a thing or not. And though that specific colleague who is near and dear to me would often speak to me about their identity and thinking and feeling, I'm Japanese, my native language is Japanese, that's what I grew up speaking, that's when I have inner thoughts, that's the language that's being used. And cultural tenets are very, she is very Japanese. And so again, growing up in this era of where these topics thankfully are being discussed, I think is a very positive thing. And there are a lot of people who are struggling and trying to find this identity, and it's our job to support them and explore these topics in the public forum. I wanted to ask you a bit about how this relates to language, because one of your very important roles in your position is language instruction. What areas are you seeing the Japanese language develop along the lines of, let's say, gender identity? As we know in Japan, a lot of these words tend to get dropped anyway, but there are still times when we have to refer, or when we do refer to people like, oh, karewa, like that male there, or kanojo wa, that female. How are we seeing Japanese, the language, change in these areas?
This is something I struggle daily as well, to be honest. For example, in Japan, there has been a really active discussion around how to address your spouse, for example. And I think many people mistakenly use kanai or danna or yome to refer to one's spouse. So yome correctly refers to, from the perspective of a mother-in-law, to refer to the daughter-in-law. But nowadays in mass media, a lot of people use yome as a wife. So that's an incorrect usage. But it also a really interesting culture because yome literally means in Chinese character, it has two components: woman, house. So women who's inside the house, who's in charge of house. So that also show the kind of gender role, gender expectation that we have in Japanese society. And certainly it is changing. So the discussion is, should we start calling our spouse like tsuma for wife and otto for husband? Yes, it's becoming more popular to call your own spouse in such a way, but it's still difficult to decide how you address someone else's spouse. You want to be polite and respectful without reinforcing this gendered language, but we don't seem to have a good alternatives to goshujin or okusan. Yeah, so I think this is something that the Japanese language continues to evolve. And I think this is something I can introduce to class because language is never static. It keeps changing. And I would like to, rather than provide, oh, these are the vocabulary that are being used, but introduce this kind of ongoing discussion to the classroom so that students can think for themselves and they can also understand the traditional ways of addressing spouses and then also different ways that are emerging nowadays to call your own spouse and also someone else's spouse. So that's something I strive to do in the classroom.
And for our members of our audience who might not speak Japanese, literally, what does okusan mean?
It's like someone in the back or someone inside, the house in the back. So
okusan usually, in usage wife. Means wife.
Somebody else's wife. Yeah.
Someone in the back of the house.
Yeah.
Right, in the rear of the house.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this, even in, I would say, comparatively speaking, English does not change as quickly. I think this is a subjective viewpoint, and it might be wrong, compared to Japanese. But even in English, we're seeing, the terminology of partner, when referring to one's spouse. There are certain nuances to saying husband and wife, and the etymology of those terms. So, and I'm heartened to see that.
I think because of my research focus that is on race and gender, I see a lot of new terms appearing in Japanese vocabulary, but many of them are loan words. So they're in
Gairaigo. Loan words from other countries.
For example, like LGBT. That has become a buzzword in Japan in the last few years. And instead of, using seiteki shosusha or seiteki minority, I think people now prefer to use LGBTQIA. And that's something that I see that's happening in terms of vocabulary. So it's really interesting because instead of using a vernacular or like incorporate something indigenous to us, we are simply using the term that are used in an English context. And I do wonder if the concept actually comes along as much as the language disseminates. So I'm really interested in the gap between the dissemination or popularization of the language and the fact that these concepts are being accepted. I'm curious about that. Yeah.
That I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, because we do see a lot more of these words being used colloquially in Japan. But whether or not that is leading to or in the same way accepting these concepts into the culture, that might be a separate issue. That's very interesting. Well, I wanted to finish up today by asking you about what you see in this role, what you want to do at NC State for our students. I wanted to just listen to your thoughts about what you'd like to do.
So I think what you said earlier is really resonating with what I envision to do here, and to really present Japan as more multifaceted, more diverse, you know, a subject, you know. People might have a certain image about Japan or Japanese language or Japanese people, and I want to break all these stereotypes. And I want to present all the controversies that we have in our language usages, and then also different social issues that we have in Japanese society. So instead of simply, you know, praising Japan as a country, I would like to go deeper to really understand what it means to be in Japan or to be part of Japanese society today, and who are being included, who are being excluded, and why and when and how does it happen, et cetera. And I would love to offer opportunities for the students to be exposed to diverse perspectives and opinions about Japan as possible. And I want them to develop critical thoughts and perspective toward Japan and Japanese people. And hopefully I can encourage as many people to go study abroad. And I would love to be in assistance for that with the Japan Center and other faculty members on campus as well.
We're all here to support you. We're so happy that you're here with us and
Thank you
here
very
for our
much.
students.
Really thrilled to be here as well.
So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And once again, welcome to the Wolfpack.
Thank you very much.